Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Reena Patel, and I will be chairing this afternoon's session. So we're going to start with a platform presentation shortly, which is 15 minutes. We've then got 2 rapid-fire presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A. And then we've got 2 more presentations following that, and then a Q&A. Okay, so first up, we've got Hilary Cox, who's going to talk to us about head motion during turning in people with Parkinson's disease and older adults. Thank you, Hilary.
Fantastic. Good afternoon. My name's Hilary. I'm a physio that works in Falls, but I'm also the regional representative for ACPIVA, and I'm presenting on my NIHR internship project. So I was looking at turning, which is not straightforward whatsoever, pun intended. Gait laboratory research has focused on straight line walking for many, many years. And it's only recently we started looking at turning. And part of that's due to digital advancements, but also the acknowledgement that 35 to 40% of the steps we take every day are in a turning direction. So it warrants just as much research as walking in a straight line. A video surveillance study saw that 13% of the falls observed occurred during a turning task. And if you fall whilst turning, you're 7.9 times more likely to break your hip. So it's an important area of research because we do it all the time. It often goes wrong. And when it does go wrong, there's very serious implications. But taking one step further back, why is it we turn in the first place? It's important to picture this as a spatial orientation task. We're navigating the space around us, so our sensory systems are involved in order to see what path we're taking and navigate obstacles. Unlike an owl, if you try and look at the person behind you right now, give it a go, you'll notice not only have you moved your head and neck, but you've had to rotate your shoulders. So that is a process of what we call axial rotation. So if you turn whilst walking, you initiate the turn with your eyes, then with your head, rotation through your trunk, then pelvis, and finally your feet. And this process of axial rotation has been shown to be altered in older adults with a history of falls, in those with a mild cognitive impairment, and those with a concern for falls using the FESI scale. So we know even in an older adult population, this changes. And we know that in the Parkinson's population, it's often been attributed that this axial rigidity that they refer to in Parkinson's is due to the motor and non-motor symptoms you see on the slide. And that's further reinforced by the study that looked at the on and off levodopa medication state and saw that that axial rigidity was reduced when they were on levodopa. So there is a suggestion there's a Parkinson's disease process involved. We know this happens in other populations as well. But it is an emerging area of research. We don't know everything about turning just yet. So this project was looking at trying to identify the differences in head motion, given the spatial orientation part of the turning task. It's important to understand what the head is doing, but also to look at the bigger picture. So if we use clinical measures, looking at overall function, how does head motion relate to the patient's experience? So for this presentation, I'm only presenting the balance confidence aspects. We did look at other scales as well. So this was extracted from the ICICLE study, which was a longitudinal study from diagnosis of Parkinson's, with both the blue being the cognitive component of the study and the beige being the gait, which is what we're looking at predominantly today. And the data presented today is from the 36-month review. This was a 72-month longitudinal study. And we wanted a moderate disease severity. So this review gave us that mix that we were looking for. If you were here in the last session, you've seen this picture before. So apologies if I'm going over ground. But Sean So has already been mentioned. In that balance confidence that we measured using the ABC, Activity Specific Balance Confidence Scale. The ABC measures the pre-fall part of the falls self-efficacy continuum. So that's looking at how confident someone is to remain balanced, as opposed to concern for falling or balance recovery that was mentioned earlier today. We use the ABC because it does have an identified cutoff that classifies fallers from non-fallers in older adults, but also that it's been validated in people with Parkinson's. So in order to measure turning, so not everyone's super familiar with gait analysis, that sensor, the APDM Opal sensor, was attached in 5 different locations, but for this project, we're only looking at the head. The participant was walking a 10-meter straight line walking task on a gait right mat, and then afterwards did a 180-degree turn. So we're looking at a walking turn as opposed to a static turn. And they did 3 passes in each attendance. So for each attendance, we have 3 recordings, but they continuously wear a sensor. We need to know where the turns occur. So we use this validated algorithm using coding to extract where the turn started and stopped. And then we broke it down into 3 phases: start, middle, and end. These sensors are quite baffling. It took me quite a while to get my head around everything that they do. But if we break it down into 2 main components, is spatiotemporal, so that's how long it takes to turn, the velocity, the speed of motion, and then signal features, which looks at the 3 axes of motion. The signal-based features is 22 in each axis, giving us a total of 66 features, which you can imagine is a lot of different variables to look at. But particularly what we tend to look at is the root mean squared, which is an overall measure of movement intensity, which, as you can imagine, in Parkinson's is something we're keen to look at with bradykinesia. So when we look at the groups, we had 54 old adults and 36 people with Parkinson's, with an average Hoehn-Yahr of 2, so moderate severities we were looking for. When we used Mann-Whitney-U test to compare the groups, we didn't have a significant difference in age, but did have a significant difference in cognition and balance confidence, which we would expect given the disease process. When we then looked at the difference between these 2 groups using those signal features, remembering there's 66 of them, I won't show you a table with all the results because you'd need a far bigger screen to be able to read any of it. I've given pictures here so you can actually visualize each of these different axes. You can see that there's roughly a similar amount in each plane. A slight increased predominance in the vertical plane, and certainly across all more features from the gyroscope than the accelerometer, which is seen in other studies where the gyroscope tends to be more accurate and sensitive. But overall, no particular clear picture of which axis, other than there's less movement intensity in the people with Parkinson's, which is what we would have hypothesized. When we then looked at the balance confidence and correlated this using Spearman's correlation coefficient, you can see a very clear relationship that the vertical axis is what counts when it comes to balance confidence. You can see there was no correlations with the older adults, so we can see this is specific to the Parkinson's disease process. When we then go back and look at the spatiotemporal features, so of these features, only the ones on the left were different between the groups. Duration of turn does not, I'm assuming the whole room would be in agreement with me, would have predicted that one. And again, the velocity and peak angular velocity was lower because the people with Parkinson's took longer to turn. But again, if we then correlate, do any of these measures match up with balance confidence? So you can see duration to turn and angular velocity in both groups didn't reach significance. However, peak angular velocity did. So it's telling us that the peak angular velocity is far more sensitive measure of turning quality and how it impacts on the lived experience of people with Parkinson's. As a vestibular specialist, I had a hypothesis about how the sensory systems are involved in turning, and this is something that hasn't been investigated thoroughly in the past. So the threshold here is 150 degrees per second, which is a recommended speed to conduct dynamic visual acuity testing, which is a functional measure of gaze stability. So anything to the left-hand side of the threshold would suggest a reliance on the visual system and on the right vestibular. And you can see here a clear relationship that as the peak velocity drops, so does the balance confidence. And when you insert the threshold, 71% of the people with Parkinson's were relying on their visual system. And when you add the blue control dots, you can see a far flatter relationship with no significance, and that only 31% of the controls turned under the threshold. This study started well before I started my internship, so we didn't go and do vestibular testing on this cohort. So we can't prove a relationship, but it is the first time people have tried to look at sensory integration in turning for people with Parkinson's, which does suggest further research is required to understand why we've seen what we've seen in this study. Particularly because there's an emerging area of research that has identified quite a high prevalence of vestibular dysfunction in people with Parkinson's. So what we could be seeing here is relating to motor symptoms such as bradykinesia, freezing and rigidity, or it could be vestibular dysfunction. We don't know, so further research is required. What we can conclude is that head movement during turning does differ between people with Parkinson's and older adults. And these sensors provide a wealth of data, but it's not useful in clinical settings. We can't deal with hundreds of different variables. So we need to synthesize this down to a singular variable that actually could be measured in clinic. And peak angular velocity was very consistent in its findings across different outcome measures and does correlate with balance confidence. So further research is definitely required to understand if peak angular velocity responds to treatment and what would a normative value be for peak head angular velocity during turning. And this is particularly important because current clinical assessments look at duration to turn, and that didn't correlate with balance confidence. So things like a timed 360 turn or a timed up and go test doesn't objectively measure turn quality in the same way that these types of sensors could. But we can all acknowledge that the time that it takes to set up these types of equipment and the cost doesn't make it feasible for clinics. So we need to develop a tool which is simple and effective to use. I would like to thank my research supervisors, Dr. Lisa Alcock and Dr. James Frith from Newcastle University, without whose help this very short amount of research time would not have achieved so much. I believe questions are going to be afterwards, so we can ignore this slide.
Thank you, Hilary. I'd like now to introduce Rhiann, who's going to talk us through in 5 minutes, so no mean task, depression in the association between mobilisation timing and live discharge after hip fracture. Thank you, Rhiann.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying to the very end of the conference for this talk. As I said, so I'm going to be talking about one of the studies that was part of my PhD that I did last year, where I was looking at depression and the association between mobilization timing and live discharge after hip fracture. And this was a secondary analysis of the UK National Hip Fracture Database. Should also say I've finished my PhD now, so I'm a postdoctoral researcher, also an orthopedic physiotherapist, and also chair of Agile, one of the CSP professional networks. So my PhD broadly was me looking at hip fractures and depression, and I was looking at the role of rehabilitation to see if there was a difference in terms of risks for depression and also the impact or the association with outcomes in terms of rehab and depression in hip fracture patients. So this study was the final study of my PhD, and I was looking to compare the probability of discharge after hip fracture surgery conditional on being alive and in hospital between patients who are mobilized within and beyond 36 hours, which going forward I'll refer to as early and late mobilization, across subgroups defined by depression. So those with depression and those without depression. My population were patients who were 60 years or older and those who had undergone surgery for hip fracture in England and Wales. And without going too much into the stats and the methods, I was looking at the conditional probability. So what that means is I was looking at those who were discharged alive at 30 days or within 30 days of their hip fracture surgery. And then I looked at the proportion of early mobilization from those with depression and those without depression, and then looked at the association between mobilization timing and the conditional probability of live discharge, again, between the depression group and the no depression groups. So I've kept my results very, very brief because I wanted to have more of a discussion and hopefully generate a discussion about what I found and kind of just my work as a whole. So I put this graph specifically because, as you can probably see, there isn't any difference, or there is very minimal difference. So really what I found was that across the depression and no depression groups, there were no difference in terms of access to early mobilization. So it was a difference of 2.2%, which really doesn't, clinically probably does not mean anything. And what this graph shows is that within the 30 days of hip fracture surgery, there is no difference between early mobilization, the association between early mobilization and being discharged alive between the two groups, the depression group and the no depression group. Now, kind of the underlying hypothesis and theme that I'd kind of been trying to investigate and that I was working on through my PhD was that maybe those people who do have depression, there is a difference in their outcomes. Maybe they are more likely to be, they might have a longer length of stay, or they might be more likely to have worse outcomes. And actually, I didn't really find that. So I started to kind of hypothesize why. And one of the bigger kind of things I was kind of thinking about was that maybe because I was focusing on the first week of the hip fracture surgery, very acute inpatient physiotherapy. This was, as I said, within 36 hours. And I was only looking within 30 days, their discharge. It might have just been too soon. That could have been one of the reasons why I wasn't seeing any difference. It could be that even if somebody was diagnosed with, new depression after their hip fracture, it could be that it might have been a few months and years down the line that I'd see an impact on their outcomes. Another consideration from that, I then started to think that maybe if I had focused more on community or also involved community physiotherapy, there might also have been a difference in the outcomes that I had seen for these patients. I didn't do that in my PhD. I didn't kind of have the time, and it was kind of my thinking evolved as I went on. But those are kind of the things that I was thinking of. Another consideration from this study was that because it was a secondary analysis of the National Hip Fracture Database, where we linked kind of other databases, I didn't have the granularity in the data to say what the difference is in the depression group, what was it to do with their depression. So I wasn't able to say when they were diagnosed, how severe their symptoms were, if they were receiving any treatment for their depression. I didn't kind of have any of that information, or even, were they diagnosed before the hip fracture, after the hip fracture. So all those kind of considerations would have likely or could have impacted, on these results or just in the relationship as a whole. But unfortunately, I wasn't kind of able to identify or kind of go into those details with this study. Post PhD now, I'm kind of in that space looking at that more. So maybe in a few years' time, I might have more more answers for you, or a bit more information. But with this study, that was kind of what I was able to find, that actually for what we're doing right now for inpatient physiotherapy, we don't really need to do anything different for patients who present with depression or depressive symptoms. And there is no kind of as far as we can tell, there's no barriers to access to care or difference in the outcomes. So that's kind of a good thing, I'd say. And as Hilary said, I've got questions, but I'll skip on to that for later on. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So please keep your questions after Umar's presentation. So Umar Mohamed Bello is going to talk us through the effect of mirror therapy on lower extremity motor function in stroke survivors. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to my presentation. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge my MSc student and the other colleagues that actually contributed towards this work, especially Eva, that did a lot in the project. So to begin with, I'll be talking on the effect of mirror therapy on lower extremity motor function and gait, and it's actually an overview of systematic reviews that we actually conducted. So the outline is going to be running through the introduction, methods, what we found, and some take-home message. So let's get started. Looking at the introduction, trying to look at mirror therapy as well as stroke. Lower limb affectation, as we all know, is one of the most common impairments that we tend to see in stroke patients. There are a lot of literature out there that talks about how this kind of problems impact on overall function of individuals, looking at ADL, quality of life. So it's a huge problem when we look at people living with stroke. There are numerous neurorehabilitation modalities looking at things like robotics, virtual reality that are out there helping out in improving lower limb function and gait in stroke patients. But specifically, mirror therapy has been chosen because of its advantages over the other modalities that we tend to have. And I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. So if I may draw your attention to the left side of the slide, this is an image depicting the setup of mirror therapy. It entails simply placing the affected limb behind the mirror while the unaffected limb is placed in front of the reflecting surface of the mirror. And you then instruct the patients to do some movements while looking into the mirror. And surprisingly, what we get in the mirror is an inverted image of what they see, and that actually depicts the limb that is located behind the mirror. And this system simply fools the brain to think that whatever they are seeing in the mirror is actually the affected limb that is located behind the mirror. So why mirror therapy? There are lots of advantages, as I've mentioned earlier. It's actually simple, it's cheap. You just need a mirror. You just place the mirror at the mid-sagittal plane of the patient. This is something you can give the patients to go home and use simply without requiring a therapist to be there. Importantly, there are so many systematic reviews that have been done out there, but we don't have consensus as to whether this modality is really effective or not on improving gait and lower limb function. So because of that, we sought out to do an overview of the systematic reviews to be able to tell if it's actually effective or not. And the aim of the overview that we conducted is actually to examine the effect of mirror therapy on lower limb function and gait of post-stroke patients. So now to what we've done, if I may still draw your attention to the left side of the slide, is talking about the overview of what we have done through the screening, and then finally reach the point of getting 7 systematic reviews that we actually included. So on the right side of the slide, just to talk about briefly on the methodology, we registered the review protocol with Prospero before we started. The design, as I've mentioned earlier, is actually an overview of systematic review, otherwise called a systematic review of systematic reviews. And in terms of conducting and reporting the review, we actually went by the Prisma framework and also used the PCOS approach to come up with our research question. We searched different databases that are relevant in health sciences to get the papers. And we did deduplication and screening processes through the title, abstract, and full text screening using Rayan software. And also we use RefWorks to guide the management of the data that we collected from the databases. In terms of data extraction, we actually use customized extraction sheet using Excel to actually pull the data. And we use SWIM's guideline, which is synthesis without meta-analysis guideline, to kind of synthesize the data that we collected. Finally, we use JBI checklist for systematic reviews to be able to tell the quality of the papers that we actually included. So this is what we found. We found 7 systematic reviews. 5 of them had meta-analysis, 2 only did narrative synthesis. And these papers were published between 2015 and 2023. And the primary studies included were 65 in number. And overall, there were around 2,455 participants in the primary studies that were included in the systematic reviews. And the mean time for the stroke is actually displayed there between 5.7 days to 42 months. But before I leave this slide, just to clarify, the number of studies we had were 65, but there are duplicates that appeared in multiple systematic reviews. And we did a mapping to show the reader that these are the papers that are occurring. This is just to minimize exaggeration of the finding that we got from the review. So on the right side of the slide is actually the JBI results. And what we found is that all the studies had good methodological quality, looking at the rating there. So it's actually 8 and above, I think, what we have. So it shows that the quality is good. Okay. So in terms of the effect of mirror therapy on lower limb function, what we found from the reviews is that looking at the meta-analysis specifically, is that there was some significant kind of improvement in terms of motor function. We can see the standardized means difference is ranging from moderate to high, 0.47 to 0.89, and it was significant in multiple of the systematic reviews that we looked at. Importantly, we also look at gait speed, and what we found is that there is some kind of significant improvement looking at the significant standardized means difference as well, and also the mean difference of 0.10 meter per second, which is quite high. In terms of balance, we haven't found any consistent findings. There were kind of varied findings across. So finally, the take-home message is that mirror therapy can be effective in improving lower limb function as well as gait speed. In terms of recommendation for future, what we're thinking about now is actually to see how it can be applicable in acute care setting, which is the difficulty. We are running a study presently in Glasgow to see how it can be applied in acute care setting, testing the feasibility of it at that in those kind of settings. And further works is needed to actually identify the feasibility, as I've mentioned earlier, and also resource and training is also something to actually look at. I have my email underneath that. I couldn't provide the reference list due to limited reference and slide space that we have. But if you have any question or you need further kind of explanation of what I've actually said, I'm happy to answer any question or any kind of discussion that you want to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Umar. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Hi there. Sorry, I can't remember your name on the far left. Yeah, hi. So in older adults, depression often goes undiagnosed. Have you considered how that sort of has affected your data and whether that is one of the elements and reasons as to why you wouldn't necessarily see a huge intergroup difference? And then considering the sort of the mortality rate at sort of a year, why is it that you chose to sort of do 30 days rather than look at an extended time and see if there was a difference in mortality rate at that point?
Yeah, so the first question in terms of it going undiagnosed, definitely yes. That was kind of a big consideration I had through. I think it definitely is an issue. I was quite lucky in that because I was using the National Hip Fracture Database, it was quite a large sample size, which I didn't quite say. But for my no depression group, there were 106,000. For my depression group, there were 9,500. So compared to other data sets, I did have I had quite high numbers to use. But it was one of the discussion points that there is a high chance that I had missed, or that some patients were missed who hadn't been diagnosed either because it had been picked up or their symptoms were mistaken for something else. I also spoke about, I don't know if you know the 3Ds kind of triangle that's spoken about of delirium, dementia, and depression, where there's lots of overlapping symptoms, and therefore one can be diagnosed for another, or one is missed because it's diagnosed for another. So I kind of pulled all those out into my discussion. Again, I didn't quite come to an answer, as to say, this is what we can do, this is what's been done, but I definitely kind of acknowledged that, that exists. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? Rianne, I know you wanted to pull out some more discussion. Is there anything else you want to elaborate on? Because I know the 5 minutes is quite restrictive. So,
So it was. I think the main thing that I kind of, and this was from the paper, but also throughout my PhD, was that this whole depression, the kind of a diagnosis of depression, actually might be quite restrictive. And actually, I kind of played with using the title depression and or depressive symptoms, because what I was finding was that in older adults, it might not actually be a clinical diagnosis of depression that a lot of them have. Actually, the majority of these patients tend to have a sub-threshold depressive symptoms, which doesn't quite meet that, ICD 10 or 11, I think we're on 11 now, or the DSM coding for a clinical diagnosis, but they still have symptoms that impact them in their day-to-day, in their life, as in engaging with within therapy. And that could be things like wanting to get out of bed, wanting to do things they enjoy. Even clinically, as a orthopedic therapist now, I can go to a number of patients and say, should we get up? They say no. And I say, why? And they say, I just don't feel, I feel low today, you know. But that doesn't quite meet the threshold for depression, but they're still a very important and considerate population, or population to consider rather. So some of the previous studies that I had within my PhD, I focused more on those with depressive symptoms. And in this one, in my rehab papers, I focused on those with depression. But kind of going forward, that was something that I'm still kind of trying to figure out and play with, and trying to capture as many people as I can, so not exclude, you know, those who either do have a diagnosis or those who don't have a diagnosis. And then also, if I've got time, another kind of consideration I had was also the presentation of depression, in that it's often episodic. So with this paper, the diagnosis of depression was from in hospital when they had the hip fracture surgery, or it was any point in the year prior to that hospitalization, which means that I might have, there is a chance that I've included someone in the depression group that maybe is not actually currently experiencing depression. You know, they might not be experiencing the symptoms. They might have had been diagnosed, you know, 8 months ago with depression, received medication, received treatment, and it's in remission now, but they're still in my depression group because I've got that coding. So there is also that consideration as well. So there was a number of things. And yeah, those are some of the other considerations I had around this study and in my PhD as a whole.
Thank you, Rhiannon. And I'm sure we can all relate to that, approaching a patient who's low in mood and how we might want to think about that in view of your findings. Thank you. Any further thoughts or comments? Ed, we've got the microphone coming. It's just for the online audience, just so they can hear your question. Thank you.
Cool. It's just really for Hilary about kind of the Parkinson's and the turning. Do you think there's any kind of like you're talking about further research, like maybe researching into how it affects maybe with a 360-degree turn or more of a dynamic type of turn? So obviously we've looked at the 180 turn, but do you think that would throw up any kind of different results? Or
Yeah, so the turning literature has approached how to assess turning in very different ways. So there are studies that looked at a 360 turn from a static start. There's studies that looked at doing more of an obstacle course with multiple different turns in different directions. Different turn strategies tend to bring out different things in people with Parkinson's. So like unexplained turns where they quickly were given a stimulus to turn one way or the other, increased freezing, for example. So we are still not very certain about all the different constructs within turning. I think the 360 turn would have more challenge with spatial orientation than a shorter turn. But we still, as I said, no one's actually looked at the sensory contributions to turning, particularly in people with Parkinson's. So it's an area of unknown, but certainly in clinical practice, worth thinking about different ways you can train turning, with whether it be unplanned or planned, how far, and particularly thinking about, have you assessed the vestibular system and is that contributing? So on a patient-based, person-based setting, you can think about, have I assessed if vestibular function is impacting on their turn?
Do I have time for one more question? Yep. Oh, yeah, go.
Looking at the program to get the names right, because I'm really bad with names. One comment was for Rhiannon, because I did a similar thing with databases, but it was with pain, medication, and people with CP. So I guess you did it cross-sectional.
So I had 2 years worth of data that I looked at. Yeah.
I think that element of the changeable nature of depression, it might be seen better in a longitudinal study. Are they consistently, and then you maybe that's the one thing that might trigger that. And the other question, it was for the vestibular study, because you mentioned about the frequency that people with Parkinson haven't seemed to have vestibular dysfunction, but it was quite a big, it was 40 to 90%, I think. But I was just curious, is it similar to the general elderly population, that the rate of vestibular dysfunction compared to the Parkinson's population? Or
I mean, prevalence of vestibular dysfunction in healthy older adults is not very well understood. In people with falls, there was a great systematic review last year that showed 61% of older adults with falls have a degree of vestibular dysfunction. That was typically using clinical bedside tests, which aren't gold standard, so it's probably an underreport. And that prevalence was looking at a scoping review. The reference for that was a scoping review, and there's no one gold standard vestibular test, in that we need to use many different tests to look at all the different functions. And there's definite pattern that the vestibular spinal reflex is implicated more so than the vestibular ocular reflex. And certainly in a static context, sensory integration imbalance is impacted in Parkinson's. And we know that if they have Pisa syndrome or lateral trunk flexion, it increases the prevalence of vestibular dysfunction. One study in lateral trunk flexion found 100% in a small sample. So as I said, it's emerging. There's only about 6 or 7 published studies, and what tests they used, what severity of Parkinson's did these people have, varied wildly. But even if you took an average of 43 to 90, it's still a very significant percentage. It's a good question with not a great answer.
Right, thank you very much. So if I can just have another round of applause of gratitude for our panel. And I'd now like to invite Jane onto the podium, Jane Schofield, who's going to share with us her work around Your Care Needs You intervention. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for getting to this stage, and everyone online as well. My name's Jane Schofield. I'm a research allied health professional, and I work in the Yorkshire Quality Safety Research Group. So that's applied health research. My clinical expertise and experience is in children's therapy, and I've also worked as a service coordinator and manager as well. So the title of the talk today is Your Care Needs You Intervention, Learning from the Partners at Care Transitions Research Project. So the background to this project is that we know that transitions from hospital to home for over 75s are risky. And we can look at this in 2 measures. We can think about hospital readmissions, and we can think about adverse events that happen after the discharge home. It's estimated that 19% of the adults in this cohort are readmitted quite soon after their hospital discharge, and that 30% of those readmissions could be prevented. It's also known that adverse events are experienced by about 20% of the people in this cohort who go home. We'll talk later about what type of adverse events this includes, and also that 62% of those are preventable. So there's great potential there for something to reduce these readmissions and reduce these adverse events for the benefit of patients and for services. So the overall aim of the PACT studies, that's Partners at Care Transitions, was to improve the safety and the quality of these care transitions and these care transfers from hospital to home for this cohort. And this was done by using an intervention called Your Care Needs You, and this was co-produced with patients and carers. So the basic ethos of Your Care Needs You is that patients are doing more and knowing more and involved more with their care while they're on the ward. And in essence, they're practicing stuff that they need to do when they get home. So the main elements of Your Care Needs You are shown on the left-hand side of the slide. And there are 4 components, and these were all developed in the earlier stages of the PACT study through it looking at evidence and interviews with staff and with patients and families. So the main one is health. The first one is health, that the person, while they're in the hospital, is encouraged to ask and know more and understand more about what's happening to them and why. The second is daily activities, and that's the one that really applies to us as health professionals and as therapists, that the patients, while on the ward, are doing as much as they can to take part in their daily activities on the ward. medications. The other aspect is that patients understand and know what medicine they're taking and how and when, and if possible can take those medications themselves while on the ward. And lastly, an element that's found to be very important was that the patients, after they get home, they know what to do should something go wrong. They're provided with that information, which is different from a discharge letter. They're told that when they go home, before they go home. On the right-hand side, you can see that we describe the intervention as what's called a hybrid intervention. So some of the materials that the ward staff could use were mass-produced, if you like. There's a booklet that patients were given where they have a chance to write down different things and ask what questions they might want to ask on the ward round to give some information about being more proactively involved and participating in their care. And the QR code gives... and the website, you can see where some of those resources are available. Also, there were materials that the wards could develop themselves. For example, ideas about activities. This is an example of a poster that could be shared with patients, put up on the ward. Keeping moving in hospital. Staff can help you build confidence to get up and keep moving. Ask staff what's safe for you to do. So the wards could tailor their own materials like this to encourage the patients for those 4 components, and could link it up with existing activities on the ward, such as an activity group or an exercise session run by therapists. So it's called a hybrid. There's the tailor-made materials and the ward-developed materials, and that included the advice sheet for what to do when you get home. So the final phase of the PACT study took place between 2021 and 2023, and that included a cluster randomized controlled trial of this Your Care Needs You intervention, and that was done on 39 wards in 11 different hospitals. So there were different sizes of hospital and different types of ward, all routinely treating patients, including patients in the 75 and over cohort. There was also a process evaluation done in 8 wards, but today we're going to think more about the randomized controlled trial and think about the data that was collected that was analysed for clinical effectiveness, fidelity, and also cost effectiveness. So the methods for this, the wards were covered a range of specialities in a range of different hospitals. They routinely cared for older people, and the wards were randomly allocated by the data unit so that they were either an intervention ward that did the Your Care Needs You intervention, or a control ward where it was activities as usual. So the primary outcome for this study was 30-day unplanned readmissions, and that was done with a big cohort, which was from all the wards that were involved, patients of that age range. Then there was a secondary outcome, which was measured with, which was looking at the later readmissions and also using a PACT-M, which was an outcome measure developed during the study, and the care transitions measure, and that was a nested cohort. So staff in the intervention wards were given training on how to use the materials, how to develop their own things, how to implement Your Care Needs You. And information was gathered by members of the PACT research team and by research teams in some of the participating hospitals as well. So a lot of people were involved. And we did face-to-face interviews for the nested cohort while patients were on the wards, and then they had phone calls to follow up afterwards. The wards also gave, and the trusts gave the ward readmission data. So analysis was carried out for these 3 things: the clinical effectiveness, the fidelity, and cost effectiveness. So what did we find out? We found out that in terms of the clinical effectiveness, there were 2 main components. And the first is the readmissions, which we looked at right at the beginning. So the risks, the odds of readmission at 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months weren't significantly different between the intervention group and the control group. So I'm not a statistician, but the easiest way of defining this and describing this is if we looked at an individual patient, we wouldn't see a difference between a patient that had been on the control ward or the intervention ward. We didn't see for an individual patient it would make a difference for them. However, what we did find that at all these time points, the 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months after discharge, The unplanned readmission rate was lower with the intervention group. So something had happened on those wards using the intervention that had reduced that rate. And over time, the 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months, it was cumulative. So by the 3-month rate, it was a statistically significant reduced rate in the readmissions. Then if we look at the adverse events, so you'll see there's some of the events that were recorded and that we were collecting the data about. So these included things like falls or physical things, but also difficulty in getting supplies or having to get appointments for follow-up and so on. And we found a significant reduction in these adverse events for all the timeframes for the 1 month after discharge. So 1 month after discharge, the patients who'd been on the intervention wards were having fewer of these adverse events. So the benefits that we found were reduction in adverse events earlier on, about a month after discharge, and then the significant reduction in readmission was at 3 months. So just a bit about the fidelity. The fidelity is looking at how well was the intervention implemented. Now you'll know if you remember the dates given, 2021 to 23, there was a lot of effect of COVID still happening in that time. That meant that, for example, wards where they'd previously had a communal area or a dining room, then they were shut. Patients were restricted to bays quite a lot. So the whole infrastructure in which we were trying to do this and staff were trying to implement the intervention was very different. Also, staff who'd been trained to do the intervention, they might be redeployed to a different ward, or the ward would change composition. So a lot was going on. However, we did find that most of the wards had a go at doing it, and we see there were results. What was most effective was where the wards had developed their own materials, and particularly the advice sheet for home. That was really important, an important part of it. In cost effectiveness, the cost analysis done in terms of reduced readmissions and the adverse events, looking at costs to the services and quality adjusted life years, it was in favour of the intervention. So that showed that in terms of cost and the quality of life for patients, there were improvements there. So conclusions, what can we say? So we can say that we did find, despite all the practical challenges, that your care needs, you did support staff and patients and their families to have greater involvement in their care. The underlying ethos is that these patients are knowing more and doing more, and we could see the benefits of that. The study shows that this increased involvement has the potential to improve the safety and the quality of transitions to home, and to reduce readmissions and to reduce the adverse events as well. If we can find ways to support staff to encourage better participation of patients and patient involvement in their care, this could lead to even more benefits. The potential impact. So if our patients know more and do more, we can say that this contribute. How can this help us as health professionals? So this can help us in our day-to-day work. We talked earlier on about motivating patients. If we can show that there's evidence that if patients are involved in their care, it will benefit them, then that's a powerful tool to use when we're talking to patients and their family members as well. We can influence trust or ward cultures and policies and practices. And it also shows that if you are wanting further staffing or further services to develop, this could be used as evidence to show that increasing the participation of patients and supporting that and promoting that will be of benefit to them and their carers and to you as clinicians and services as well. So, approvals and acknowledgements. So thanks to my PACT colleagues, particularly to Professor Rebecca Lawton from the University of Leeds and Jenny Murray, who were the initiators and leaders of the study, and my colleagues, and also the patient participation research group who helped to co-design the materials. There's some references there, and then also questions, but I think we're coming to questions later. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask, well, firstly, thank you very much, Jane. That was really interesting, and there's lots of food for thought as you were talking. Can I ask if Hannah Warwick is in the audience? Wonderful, right, that's great. So if you want to take a seat for a moment, just on the table. So just introducing Hannah Warwick. Hannah's going to talk to us about evaluating the efficacy of functional resistance training by sport and exercise professionals for inpatient deconditioning prevention. Thank you.
Hi, thank you again for staying. This actually leads quite nicely from Jane's presentation. I'm going to discuss a service evaluation on the efficacy of functional resistance training by sport and exercise professionals for inpatient deconditioning prevention. So a little bit of background. As we know, elderly patients make up a lot of hospital admissions, 2/3, and as Jane said, readmission rates are really high. And the recent pressures on the NHS over the past few years have led to an over-reliance on intermediate care and adult social care. This leads to increased wait times in hospitals, which causes quite severe deconditioning in patients. And research shows that strength and conditioning for inpatients in over 65s improves physical performance, improves quality of life, and reduce the negative effects following hospital admission. So our team was brought about by the Days Kept Away from Home collaborative within the NCA, so the Northern Care Alliance, and that had 3 aims: to prevent deconditioning, to improve patient outcomes, and to promote strength-based conversations. So our team was made up of 1 physiotherapist, team lead, which is myself, and then 4 exercise and independence facilitators, all with sport and exercise backgrounds. So I've done sport and exercise therapy or sport and exercise physiology at university. We worked closely with the quality improvement team, and our aim was to prevent the effects of deconditioning by maintaining or improving 30-second sit-to-stand, hand grip strength, De Morton's mobility index, and overall muscle strength using a handheld dynamometer. In the initial phase, this ran from September last year to February this year, we went across multiple wards across the NCA and chose the wards that we thought would benefit most. And they tended to be elderly medicine and orthopaedic wards. And our aim was to prevent the effects of deconditioning. And we did that through daily individualized functional resistance training. So that involved strength training using resistance bands, dumbbells, ankle and wrist weights, balance and function. And that all depended on what we found in their initial assessment. That was done via one-to-one sessions or groups if feasible. And we recorded all the outcomes on initial and on discharge. And we also looked at patient pathways. So for those of you who are not aware of patient pathways, it's dependent on what their level of need is. So pathway 0 is no support. 1A is home with a package of care. 2, intermediate care, and then 3, 24-hour care. So we recorded that when we picked them up and then on discharge. And then this is just a summary of our results from the initial phase. So the first graph on the left is average engagement. So as you can see, across all the wards, that was quite high, almost 80% or above. And then the ward comparison in the middle there, that's all of the outcomes that we took. And as you can see, on average, they all increased, which suggests that patient strength improved, patient's function improved. And then this one on the right, this is the relationship between engagement and hand grip strength. And we found that the patients that engaged less, their hand grip strength actually reduced. And then the patients that engaged more, their hand grip strength increased. So that suggests that patients that don't engage in activity in hospital do in fact decondition, which we know, but there's not really much evidence to show that. And then the pathway change by engagement at the bottom there. The pathways was one of the, sorry. The pathway change was one of the big things that we looked at, because that has a really big financial impact. And we found that, again, the patients that engaged more were more likely to see a pathway downgrade, so go from needing intermediate care to going home with a package of care instead. And then the patients that engaged less were more likely to see a pathway upgrade, so need more an increased level of assistance. But I will add that there are loads of factors impacting that. It's not just how active and deconditioned or not they are. So next steps. So from the initial phase, we found that patients that required intermediate care actually benefited most. And there were multiple reasons for that, but they become lower priorities for the therapy teams, and they're often quite long wait times for especially out of area patients. So from that, we decided we'll all go back to Salford Hospital in the NCA and just focus on the pathway 2s. And the results so far show that we've seen a 40% pathway downgrade. So 40% of the patients that we've seen, we've managed to get home with or without care package rather than to intermediate care. And the results support the idea that we can utilise the skills for people with sport and exercise backgrounds within the NHS, which hasn't been done before. And it's a really good way of expanding the workforce and giving people new opportunities within the NHS. And we're currently putting together a business case to expand the team to cover all sites across the NCA. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'd like to open the floor for any questions. Any from our virtual audience?
Question for Hannah, really. I work with exercise professionals in prehabilitation, and I think they're really key in bridging between NHS and lifestyle changes. I don't know what my question is, really. Have you got any thoughts on that, or any kind of areas where you think that can be developed?
I think from their backgrounds at university, they are really knowledgeable in programming and doing the strength and conditioning for patients and the lifestyle exercise educational aspect of it as well. So I think they play a really key role, or could play a really key role in the NHS. And further than that, trying to help prevent like the effects of longer term conditions and prevent the hospital admissions in the first place.
Just out of interest, did your staff members, because they often work in those community settings and leisure centres as in addition to some of what they do? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. None of my staff actually had done. 2 of them came straight from university, so had no clinical experience whatsoever. But their academic knowledge just enabled them to do the job really well. And then the other 2 had been therapy assistants in the hospital before, so they had the more hands-on clinical experience, so the team worked really well together.
If they did, it'd work really well for continuity of supporting them on discharge to carry on exercising, for example, and things like that. Yeah, that's
one thing that we want to look towards moving forward, is doing, because what I didn't say in the presentation either is that we do an educational element as well. So we give all our patients a leaflet and explain the risks of not exercising and the benefits of exercising. So one of the things that we're looking into doing moving forwards is doing like follow-up conversations with patients that have been discharged to try and educate them, and we send them programs, individualized programs for them to do at home via an app. So yeah.
Excellent. Sounds really good. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? There's just one there, Claire.
Okay, so you said you had 2 people that were therapy support workers that came in. Was there any feeling from the wider therapy support teams that they were having opportunities for their progression taken away from them because you were getting sport and exercise scientists in?
No, we didn't have that, to be honest. The issues were the stepping on toes and defining each role, because there is a lot of overlap. So that took quite a while to define what my team's role is compared to what a therapy assistant's role is. That was one of the big challenges at the start. But that's with time and kind of having more presence on the ward and us realising what they're doing and them realising what we're doing, that has ironed out now, and it is working really well, and we're working with the therapy teams rather than against them now, which is what we want.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I had a question. It was for you, Jane, actually. And I'm interested to know about the role of the family and the carers in this work, and if you've got anything to share in terms of how to optimise the resources for the families and carers.
Yeah, thanks. That's something that certainly when we were starting to implement that phase of the project, it was a time when a lot of the wards were having restricted visiting or fewer visitors. We found when we were interviewing patients with a nested cohort, we'd have some really good conversations because they weren't able to talk to other people at the time, really, apart from the ward staff. What we found in the main paper that's just in process to be published includes thinking more about why things happened. Why did we find that the reduced adverse events at 1 month and the reduced readmissions at 3 months? What was behind that? And one of the thinking that we've had from patients as well when we're doing the follow-up surveys was that patients have taken the materials home and used them and looked at them there, and families have looked at them there, so that they're able to know what to do and support that patient when they get home. So that's an element for future exploration, but we think that's what's happening. So not only have the materials been available on the ward, but they've been useful when they've got home as well.
Yeah. And I've just accessed the QR code on your slides, and there's some excellent sort of resources that people can have a look at.
Yeah, there's a lot of information there that was set up for the ward staff to use to get going with it, and that's available freely for people to use.
Thank
and
you.
Take elements of it if you just want to take certain elements of it.
Thank you. If there's no further questions or thoughts, I think we'll bring the session to a close. So my thanks to Jane and Hannah for some excellent presentations this afternoon. And thank you all for joining. I wish you a safe journey home.
That brings the CSP Annual Conference 2024 to a close. What a fantastic few days throughout the Students' Conference on Thursday and then the main conference yesterday and today. I've had an absolutely wonderful time, and this job has always been a huge privilege for me, but never more so than meeting with members and over the last few days and just seeing the energy and the quality that exists within this profession. I've loved meeting so many of you and being able to spend some time talking to you, understand where you're seeing the profession and helping me and the CSP to make sure that we use our time, our resources and our energies in the right place. The presentations were absolutely fabulous, and as somebody who spent quite a deal of time in academia and research, seeing the quality of those presentations and the content of them was really heartwarming. But also just soaking up that warmth and that vibrant atmosphere that existed over the last few days. And I know that exists every day within this profession. And I wanted to thank you for that. And I hope that you feel the same. And I hope that you feel that it's been really valuable being part of it. Ordinarily, I would sign off now with a breezy see you next year. But this year is, I have something more to add, because not only will we be back next year, but it'll be the first step on a brand new 4-year-long journey around the UK. And I am very clear that the CSP is a UK-wide organisation serving members across all 4 countries, the Crown States and the Isle of Man. So the next year, we are going to see you again, but it will be in Wales and it'll be in Newport, to be exact. In 2026, we will be in Scotland, and then we will go back to Northern Ireland and to the UK and to England. I've heard great things about last year's 4 conferences, but this is different. This is bringing the whole of PUK in all its glory, in all its size, in all its scale to the 4 countries. Everything you have seen and heard over the last 2 days will be matched and hopefully exceeded. And I am not going to be shy about saying it, that we really want the countries to almost compete with each other to have the very best conferences that we can have. These days that we get together and the amount of work that goes into these days justifies it being really the very best it could be. And I would love to see you all there, because whether it's in Wales or England or Scotland or Northern Ireland, this will be your conference for your profession. And so please make sure that you see it as such and join us for those conferences and get to know different local jurisdictions, what the pressures are in those countries, and meet colleagues there who will be really proud, really happy, and really full of energy in welcoming you. So as I say, this is the first time we have ever done this, so I mean it more than ever when I say to you, see you next year in Wales. Thank you so much, and thank you for all your involvement.
Thank you.